The morning was calm and bright, the kind of morning that makes people believe the day will pass without any trouble. The sun had risen gently, spreading its golden light across the small town. Birds were chirping, children were rushing to school, with their backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, and shopkeepers were just starting to lift their shutters. For most people, it was a regular day, nothing out of the ordinary. But for one elderly woman, this morning was important. She was around 75, her silver hair neatly tied back with a faded ribbon. She wore a simple dress, clean but a little worn from years of use, and in her hand she held a cane to steady herself. Despite her age, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her steps were slow, her back slightly bent, but her determination was clear in her eyes. Today, she needed to go to the bank to withdraw some money for her groceries and medicines. The bank wasn't too far, but for her, even a short walk felt like a long journey. Every few steps, she had to pause, breathe, and then continue again. Yet, she didn't complain. She had lived her entire life with resilience, and walking slowly to the bank was just another small challenge in her day. She enjoyed looking around as she walked to the bakery, filling the street with the smell of fresh bread, the florist arranging bright flowers in buckets, and the quiet hum of life around her. Finally, she reached the large glass doors of the bank. She took a moment to rest, adjusting the strap of her small handbag, and then pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of polish and paper. Customers were already lined up, some tapping their feet impatiently, some staring at their phones. The staff behind the counters were busy typing, stamping papers, and speaking quickly to one another. For the elderly woman, the noise and pace of the bank always felt overwhelming. It was so different from the slow rhythm of her life. But she had been coming here for years, and she trusted that she would be treated with the same patience she had always known in the past. She took a deep breath, steadied herself on her cane, and walked toward the line as she waited. She noticed how hurried everyone seemed. People sighed loudly if the line didn't move fast enough. A man muttered angrily under his breath about being late for work. A young woman shuffled through a pile of documents, checking her watch again and again. The elderly woman stayed quiet, clutching her handbag close to her chest, and waited her turn. Finally, she reached the counter. She offered a polite smile to the staff member and softly explained that she needed to withdraw some money. Her voice was gentle, almost fragile, and she carefully pulled out her small notebook where she had written down the exact amount she needed. She placed it on the counter with shaky hands, hoping she had written it clearly enough. The staff member, however, barely looked at her. He seemed annoyed by her slow speech and her hesitation. He tapped his pen on the desk impatiently as she tried to explain again. Her fingers fumbled as she searched through her handbag for her ID card. She felt nervous under the impatient stare, but she kept trying. After all, she wasn't asking for much, just her own money. In that moment, the bank, with its polished floors and busy atmosphere, felt cold and unwelcoming. The elderly woman, who had walked so carefully and bravely to get there, suddenly felt small and out of place. She remembered when she used to come years ago, and the tellers would greet her kindly, even asking about her health. But times had changed, and now everything seemed rushed, as if people had no time for kindness anymore. Still, she tried to stay calm. She thought about the groceries she needed to buy the bread, milk, and a little sugar. She thought about her medicines, which she could not miss even for a single day. That money was necessary, and she had no choice but to stand there and wait until the staff was ready to help. Around her, people in the line shifted impatiently. Someone coughed loudly, as if to remind her that she was taking too long. Another sighed heavily, muttering that the bank should have a separate counter for people who move slow. Each word stung her, but she stayed focused, determined to finish what she had come for. What she didn't know was that this ordinary morning was about to take a very unexpected turn. She had walked into the bank believing it would be just another routine trip. She had no idea that her patience, her struggle, and the way she was treated would soon catch the attention of someone she never imagined she would meet. For now, though, all she could do was stand at that counter, clutch her cane for support, and try to explain herself once again. The morning still looked ordinary to everyone else. But for the elderly woman, it was already becoming harder than she had hoped. And just beyond that moment, destiny was waiting to surprise her in the most powerful way. Asterisk, the elderly woman thought. The hardest part of her morning was behind her. She had walked all the way to the bank, taken her place in line, and finally reached the counter. She believed that soon she would be holding the money she needed for her groceries and medicine. But what happened next turned her simple task into an ordeal she never expected. As she softly explained her request, the bank employee barely looked at her. He was a young man, neatly dressed, his tie perfectly straight, and his eyes fixed more on the computer screen than on the customer in front of him. He seemed impatient, as though every second she took was wasting his time. "Do you have your ID?" he asked sharply, without even greeting her. The elderly woman nodded and began to search her handbag. Her hands trembled as she carefully moved aside her handkerchief, a small purse, and some folded papers. Finally, she found her identification card, but it slipped slightly from her fingers before she could place it on the counter. The staff member frowned, sighed loudly, and tapped his pen on the desk. "You need to be quicker, ma'am. There are other people waiting," he said, his tone more scolding than polite. The elderly woman's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She knew she was slower than others, but it wasn't because she wanted to beat, it was simply because of her age. She whispered an apology and tried to smile, hoping to ease his irritation. Behind her, the line of customers was growing restless. A man coughed deliberately, and another muttered, "This is going to take all day." Their words cut into her like little knives. She wanted to disappear, to not be the reason for anyone's impatience, but she also needed her money. She handed the ID across the counter with shaky fingers. The staff member grabbed it quickly, gave it a short glance, and started typing into his computer. His fingers moved fast on the keyboard, the clacking sounds filling the air. "What amount do you need?" he asked without looking at her. She opened her small notebook again, the same one she had carefully prepared at home. Her handwriting was neat but small, and she tilted the page toward him so he could read. "Just this much," she said softly. The young man squinted at the paper, then shook his head. "You have to fill out a withdrawal slip. You can't just hand me this." The elderly woman's heart sank. She hadn't realized the rules had changed, or perhaps she had simply forgotten. Her memory wasn't as sharp as it once was, and sometimes she relied on staff to guide her kindly. I didn't know," she murmured, her voice breaking. He pointed to a stack of small forms on a side desk. "You need to fill one of those out. Bring it back when it's done." Her eyes widened. The writing on those slips was small, the lines narrow, and her hands shook whenever she tried to write for too long. She felt overwhelmed just looking at them. Can you please help me? My hands?" She tried to explain. The man shook his head. "That's not my job. Rules are rules. Fill it out or I can't process your request." For a moment, the world seemed to spin around her. She took the slip and walked slowly to a nearby desk. Her cane clicked against the floor, and her breath grew heavier. She sat down carefully, holding the pen as though it weighed more than it should. She tried to write her name on the line, but the letters wobbled, uneven and shaky. Her eyes blurred, not from poor vision, but from the sting of tears as she struggled. People continued to glance at her, some with pity, some with annoyance. The whispers behind her grew louder. "Why don't they have someone to deal with these cases?" She's slowing everyone down. Her cheeks burned and her heart felt heavy. She was not trying to cause trouble. All she wanted was to take out enough money to buy bread, milk, and her medicine. Was that really too much to ask? She wiped her eyes quickly with her handkerchief, trying to hide her pain. She forced herself to finish the form, though the letters looked shaky and uneven. With trembling hands, she walked back to the counter and handed it over. The staff member looked at the slip and frowned again. "This is messy. You should have written it more clearly," he muttered. The elderly woman bit her lip. She wanted to cry, but she held it in. Years of life had taught her to endure pain silently. Still, this was not just about her handwriting. It was about dignity. And at that moment, she felt hers slipping away in front of everyone. The staff member sighed and reluctantly began processing the form, but his expression showed annoyance. The line of customers behind her shifted impatiently, and the atmosphere in the bank grew tense. What should have been a 5-minute task had turned into a public humiliation for her. She stood there, her cane shaking slightly as she leaned on it, her eyes fixed on the counter. The weight of everyone's stares pressed on her like a burden. She wondered why kindness had become such a rare thing. What she didn't know was that this uncomfortable moment was not the end of her day, was only the beginning. Because someone very unexpected was about to notice her. Someone whose presence would change the entire situation in a matter of moments. The elderly woman stood quietly at the counter, waiting for the young bank employee to finish processing her slip. Her fingers gripped the handle of her cane tightly, as though it was the only thing keeping her steady. She tried not to meet the eyes of the people behind her. But she could feel their frustration like a wave pressing down on her back. The staff member glanced at her form one last time, sighed loudly, and shook his head again. "This is really hard to read," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for her to hear. He pushed the slip aside for a moment and looked directly at her, his expression flat and impatient. "You know what, ma'am? I can't accept this. You'll have to do it again." The words hit her like a sudden blow. Do it again. She had already struggled so much just to fill out the slip. Her hands had shaken, her vision had blurred, and her heart had raced with embarrassment. She couldn't imagine going through that humiliation once more. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Please, sir, I tried my best. My hands, they don't work as well anymore. I just need a little help." But instead of compassion, the staff member's eyes grew cold. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said, "Rules are rules. If you can't write it properly, we can't process it. You'll have to step aside until you're ready. Other customers are waiting." Gasps and whispers rippled through the line. Some people looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded as if they agreed. To them, she was just an obstacle, a delay in their busy lives. The elderly woman's face flushed red. She could feel her dignity crumbling, piece by piece. She had lived a long life filled with struggles and sacrifices raising children. Working hard, caring for others, and yet here she was, being spoken to like a burden as if her years of existence had lost all value. She tried once more. I don't want to cause trouble. Please, could someone just help me fill it out?" Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of desperation. The young man shook his head firmly. "That's not how this works. You're holding up the line. Please step aside." Before she could say anything else, he called out, "Next." His voice rang through the room, sharp and dismissive, as if she no longer existed. The elderly woman froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She felt invisible, as though she had been erased from the moment she was told to move away. The man behind her stepped forward eagerly, handing over his documents with a confident tone, happy to replace her at the counter. For a second, she remained rooted in place, her body stiff, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, with a heavy sigh, she turned around. Her cane tapped the floor as she slowly walked away, each step heavier than the last. She didn't look up, afraid to see the faces of those watching her. When she reached the exit, she lowered herself carefully onto the stone steps outside the bank. The cool air brushed against her cheeks, but it did nothing to soothe the burning shame inside her. She placed her handbag on her lap, clutching it tightly as though it was the last thing keeping her grounded. Tears gathered in her eyes, and though she tried to blink them away, one slid down her wrinkled cheek. She quickly dabbed it with her handkerchief, glancing around to make sure no one noticed. But people did notice. Some walked past her with quickened steps, avoiding her gaze. Others glanced at her with pity, but said nothing. No one stopped. No one offered comfort. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly abandoned. She thought about all the years she had worked, the time she had saved every penny, the mornings she had stood in long lines without complaint. And now, when she was at her weakest, when she needed kindness the most, she was cast aside like an inconvenience. Her chest tightened as she whispered to herself, "All I wanted was my own money. Just a little bit." Her voice cracked, breaking the silence around her. The city moved on without her. Cars honked in the distance. Children laughed as they walked home from school. And the world carried on as if her pain didn't exist. She sat there, small and fragile, against the towering walls of the bank. But destiny has a strange way of turning moments of despair into something unforgettable. At that very moment, while she sat on the cold stone steps, someone unexpected was walking nearby. Someone whose presence was larger than life, whose shadow could command attention the way few others could. That someone was Shaquille O'Neal. And though she didn't know it yet, her story was about to change. The humiliation she had just suffered inside those bank walls would soon be replaced by a moment of courage, dignity, and justice that no one present that day would ever forget. Asterisk. The old woman sat quietly on the cold stone steps outside the bank. She placed her cane beside her and rested both hands on her small handbag, holding it tightly against her lap. For a long moment, she did not move. She simply stared at the ground, watching people's shoes pass by, one after another, as if the world had no space for her anymore. Her cheeks were still flushed from the embarrassment she had faced inside. The sound of the employee's sharp voice, "Step aside," still echoed in her ears. She could hear the shuffle of customers moving forward eagerly, glad that she had been pushed away, as though she was nothing more than an obstacle. That memory cut her deeper than any physical wound. She had lived a long life. She had seen hard days and had endured them with quiet strength. She had raised her family, paid her dues, and never asked anyone for more than she needed. But today, for the first time, she felt as if the respect she had earned through those years had simply vanished. In that bank, she wasn't treated as a valued customer. She wasn't treated as a human being. She was treated like a problem. Around her, people bustled by. Some glanced at her with a fleeting look of pity before continuing on their way. Others didn't even notice her sitting there. A group of young men walked past, laughing loudly, the sound echoing in the street, but not one of them stopped to ask if she was okay. A mother with a child glanced at her for a second, then pulled her little boy closer and hurried away. The elderly woman felt invisible. The city was alive, buzzing with voices, footsteps, and car horns, but none of that life seemed to belong. To her, she was alone, surrounded by people. Her heart grew heavier with each passing second. She thought about the simple things she needed: the groceries she had planned to buy, the medicine waiting at the pharmacy. They seemed so far away. Now, without her money, she couldn't buy them. And without help, she couldn't get her money. The thought of returning home empty-handed filled her with dread. A tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail on her wrinkled skin. She wiped it away quickly, ashamed of crying in public. In her generation, she had been taught to stay strong, to keep struggles hidden. But sometimes, no matter how hard you tried, the pain overflowed. She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Why? Why must it be this hard? I gave this world my years, my strength, and now I am cast aside. For those passing by, she was just an elderly woman sitting outside a bank. But inside her, a storm raged. It was the storm of humiliation, the sting of being treated as if she no longer mattered. Every impatient sigh from the people in line. Every harsh word from the employee. Every look of annoyance. All echoed in her mind. The weight of loneliness pressed on her chest. She had never felt so small. The tall walls of the bank behind her seemed like a fortress she could not enter. A place that had turned its back on her minutes past, though to her they felt like hours. The sky above was still bright, but inside her it felt like dusk had fallen. Then something changed. She felt a shift in the air, a new energy on the street. The sound of heavy footsteps approached, each one steady and powerful, carrying the weight of someone whose presence could never be ignored. People on the sidewalk turned their heads. Some whispered excitedly, their eyes widening as they recognized the towering figure walking down the street. It was Shaquille O'Neal to most. He was a legend of basketball, a man known around the world for his talent, his size, and his charisma. But in this moment, to the elderly woman, he was just another stranger, though a stranger unlike any she had ever seen before. His frame was enormous, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. And his presence seemed to quiet the space around him. Shaq slowed his steps when his eyes landed on her. He noticed the way she sat hunched over, clutching her handbag as though it was the only thing keeping her steady. He noticed the glistening trail of tears on her cheek, the cane leaning against the step beside her, and the quiet sadness in her eyes. For Shaq, it wasn't just the sight of an old woman sitting alone. It was the weight of her silence, the story her body carried without words. He had grown up understanding hardship, and he could recognize the face of someone who had been wronged. The people around began to murmur louder now, surprised to see the giant figure of Shaquille O'Neal in such an ordinary place. Some pulled out their phones to take pictures. Others whispered his name with awe. But Shaq paid them no attention. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman sitting alone on the steps. At that moment, something inside him told him he couldn't just walk past. He couldn't pretend not to see her pain. He knew he had to act. The elderly woman, sensing a shadow fall across her, slowly lifted her head. When her eyes met his, she gasped softly, startled by the sight of the towering man before her. She knew who he was, everyone did, but she never expected to see him standing there, looking directly at her, with concern written across his face. And that was when her story began to change. The elderly woman sat hunched on the stone steps, her small frame almost swallowed by the grand building behind her. She had wiped away her tears, but the heaviness in her heart lingered. The world seemed to blur around her, people walking past without care, cars rushing by, and voices blending into meaningless noise. She thought she was invisible, just another old woman struggling alone in a fast-moving world. But then, something shifted. A hush seemed to ripple through the street as a figure approached. It was not silence exactly, the city was still alive with sound, but there was a noticeable change. Like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Heads began to turn. People's eyes widened. Phones were lifted discreetly, some less discreetly. A few whispered his name, their voices filled with awe. Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal was walking down the sidewalk. His presence was impossible to ignore. At 7 feet tall, His body cast a shadow that stretched across the pavement, commanding attention before he even spoke a word. But it wasn't only his size that drew people's eyes, it was his energy. He walked with a calm but powerful confidence, a kind of gravity that made everyone around him pause. Shaq was used to being recognized. He had spent his life in the spotlight. From the roaring cheers of basketball arenas to the flashing cameras of TV shows and commercials. But despite his fame, he never lost the part of himself that paid attention, the part that saw what others overlooked. And on this ordinary day, what caught his eye was not the crowd, not the whispers, not the flashing cameras. It was her. The elderly woman, sitting alone on the steps, clutching her handbag like a lifeline, her cane leaning uselessly at her side. There was something in the way she sat, something fragile yet dignified, that made him slow his steps. He saw the faint traces of tears on her cheeks, the look of quiet defeat in her eyes. And in that moment, Shaq knew. This wasn't just an old woman resting outside a bank. This was someone who had been hurt. Without hesitation, Shaq veered off his path and walked directly toward her. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, confused and curious. Why was he stopping? Why was the basketball legend, the celebrity, the giant, approaching an old woman on the steps of a bank? The woman herself was startled. She had been so lost in her own pain that she hadn't noticed him until his shadow stretched across her lap. Slowly, she lifted her head. And when her eyes met his, her breath caught in her throat. "Shaquille O'Neal," she whispered, her voice trembling, almost unbelieving. Shaq bent slightly, his massive frame lowering so he could look at her at eye level. His voice was deep, calm, and surprisingly gentle. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The question was simple, but it carried more weight than anything she had heard all day. Someone was finally asking if she was okay now, rushing her, not scolding her, not dismissing her. Just asking. The woman hesitated, clutching her handbag tighter. She didn't want to be a burden, not to anyone, and certainly not to someone like him, but the kindness in his tone, the genuine concern in his eyes, unlocked something inside her. The words spilled out before she could stop them. I just wanted to get my money," she said softly, her voice breaking. "They wouldn't help me. They said my writing was too shaky, and they sent me out. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just wanted my medicine." Shaq listened, really listened. His jaw tightened as he heard the quiver in her voice, the quiet humiliation she carried. For a man who had faced fierce opponents on the court, who had stood under the bright lights of the world stage, this moment struck him in a different way. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about respect. He placed one large hand gently on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "No one should treat you like that," he said firmly. "Come on, let's go back inside together." The woman blinked, startled by his words. "Back inside? Yes," he said, with quiet strength. "I'll make sure you're taken care of." For the first time that day, she felt a flicker of relief, like a small flame in the dark. She wasn't alone anymore. Shaq extended his hand, his palm so large it seemed to swallow hers as she reached for it. Slowly, with his help, she rose to her feet. Her cane wobbled slightly, but his steady arm made her feel secure. The crowd watched in amazement. Some recorded the scene on their phones, whispering to each other about what was happening. Others simply stared, struck by the sight of one of the most famous athletes in the world bending down to help a frail old woman, treating her with the dignity the bank had denied her. And together they began to walk back toward the glass doors of the bank. The woman's steps were still slow, but this time they were stronger, steadier. With Shaq beside her, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen. She felt respected. Inside the bank, the same employees who had dismissed her just moments ago had no idea that their actions were about to come back to them in a way they could never have imagined. Because Shaquille O'Neal was not just walking her back inside, he was walking in with a purpose. Asterisk. The bank lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm, the tapping of keyboards, the shuffling of papers, the muted hum of people waiting in line. But the moment the glass doors swung open again, the entire atmosphere shifted. Shaquille O'Neal walked in, towering beside the elderly woman who leaned carefully on his arm. The sight was enough to freeze the room for a heartbeat. Conversations faltered, employees stopped mid-sentence, and every pair of eyes turned toward the enormous figure filling the doorway. Shaq's presence was magnetic. He wasn't just tall, he was commanding. His shoulders seemed to brush the edges of the doorway, and his steps were slow but deliberate, each one echoing against the polished marble floor. For a man so massive, there was no need for raised voices or dramatic gestures. His very being demanded attention. The customers in line began to whisper. Some reached for their phones, trying to capture the surreal sight. An NBA legend walking into a small-town bank with an old woman on his arm. Others simply stared wide-eyed, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. The bank staff, however, looked uneasy. The same employee who had dismissed the woman earlier now stood stiffly behind the counter, his face drained of color. He glanced nervously from Shaq to his manager, unsure of what to do. Shaq didn't march in angrily, nor did he rush. Instead, he guided the elderly woman gently back to the counter, his deep voice rumbling low but steady. "Excuse me," he said, calm yet firm, "but this lady has been treated unfairly. She deserves better." The staff member opened his mouth, fumbling for words. Shaq raised a hand slightly, not in anger, but in authority. "No." "Excuses," he said. "I saw her outside. She was humiliated when all she wanted was to withdraw her own money. That's not how you treat people. Not here, not anywhere." His voice carried through the room, heavy and commanding, but not loud. It was the kind of voice that needed no shouting. It was filled with power, dignity, and conviction. The elderly woman stood beside him, clutching her handbag, her eyes wide with disbelief. Never in her life had someone of his stature, someone so famous, stood up for her. She felt her shame slowly being replaced by something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. The customers behind her murmured in agreement. A woman whispered, "He's right. That was wrong." Another nodded, saying, "Finally, someone said it." The room seemed to shift, the tide of opinion turning in her favor. The manager, a middle-aged man in a pressed suit, stepped forward. Forcing a smile, "Mr. O'Neal," he said quickly, his voice suddenly filled with respect. "Please, allow us to correct this mistake. I assure you, we." Shaq's eyes locked on him, calm, but unwavering. "It shouldn't take someone like me walking in here for you to do the right thing," he said. She deserved patience, respect, and kindness from the start. Every customer does, especially someone her age. She's earned that. The manager swallowed hard and nodded. "You're absolutely right. I apologize for the behavior of my staff, ma'am," he said, turning to the elderly woman. "Please forgive us. We'll handle your transaction immediately." The young employee who had dismissed her earlier stood frozen, his face flushed. He looked like he wanted to vanish behind the counter. Shaq glanced at him, not with hatred, but with a weighty kind of disappointment. "Son," Shaq said evenly, "remember this moment. It costs nothing to be kind, but it costs a lot to take away someone's dignity." The words hung in the air like a lesson carved in stone. Even those watching from the line felt the impact. It wasn't just a rebuke, it was a truth that struck deeply. The bank employees rushed to process the elderly woman's withdrawal. This time, no one hurried her. No one sighed in impatience. Instead, she was treated with care. The form was filled out for her, the paperwork completed without delay. When the teller handed her the envelope of money, he did so with both hands, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "Here you go, ma'am." The elderly woman's hands shook as she accepted it, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She turned her gaze up at Shaq, her eyes glistening not with humiliation now, but with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." Shaq gave her a gentle nod, his deep voice softening. "You're welcome, ma'am. Everyone deserves respect. Don't ever forget that." The customers broke into quiet applause. Some clapped politely, others cheered softly, inspired by what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about dignity. It was about one man reminding everyone in that room of a simple truth. Kindness matters. Shaq placed a protective arm around the woman's shoulders and guided her toward the door once more. This time, when she walked, her steps were not heavy. They were lighter, stronger. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt seen, valued, and defended as the doors closed behind them. The room remained still for a moment, the echoes of his words lingering in the air. People looked at each other, shaken, reflecting silently on how they, too, treated those around them inside that bank. Shaq had not only stood up for one elderly woman, he had delivered a message to everyone. Respect is not optional. It is owed. Asterisk, as the elderly woman stepped outside the bank for the second time that day, everything felt different. Earlier, when she had been pushed out, the air had felt cold. The world had seemed heavy, and every step had been filled with shame. Now, walking beside Shaquille O'Neal, her back straightened ever so slightly. The same streets, the same crowd, even the same bright sky, all felt transformed. Because she no longer felt invisible, her fingers tightened around the envelope of money in her hand. It wasn't the paper bills themselves that gave her strength. Was what they represented. Moments ago, she had been denied not just her money, but her dignity. She had been treated as if her age made her a burden. But now, with Shaq standing beside her, she felt as though her worth had been restored in front of everyone who had watched her humiliation. The crowd, outside, hadn't dispersed. Many of those who had seen Shaq walk her back in now waited to see them emerge. Phones were raised again, but the energy in the air was no longer one of curiosity, it was admiration. Strangers nodded respectfully, some even clapped quietly. And a few whispered words of encouragement to the woman as she passed by. For years, she'd been accustomed to walking through life unnoticed, fading into the background as the world rushed past her, but in this moment, all eyes were on her and, not with pity, but with respect. She felt her chest lift as if the weight she had carried for so long was finally gone. Shaq noticed her small but visible change. He looked down at her and offered a warm smile. "You held your head high, ma'am," he said in his deep, steady voice. "Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. You've lived a long life. You deserve respect." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but these were not the same tears that had stained her cheeks earlier. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of being seen. She pressed her handkerchief gently to her face, then looked up at him with a shaky smile. "I thought I was alone in there," she whispered, "but you stood up for me. No one has done that in years." Shaq shook his head. "You're not alone. There are always people who will stand with you. Sometimes it just takes one moment to remind the world." The woman's lips trembled as she tried to form a reply. But she didn't need to say much, her eyes spoke volumes. They carried the story of a lifetime of endurance, of battles fought quietly, of dignity nearly lost but restored in a single act of kindness. A small group of onlookers approached, hesitant at first. One young man removed his cap respectfully and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what you went through. You didn't deserve that." His words made her heart swell even more. Others echoed similar sentiments, their voices sincere. If Shaq's actions had unlocked something in the crowd, a shared realization that respect and compassion should never be optional. The woman nodded softly at each of them, overwhelmed but comforted. In that moment, she wasn't just an elderly lady struggling with paperwork. She was someone worthy of admiration, of care, of dignity. And that feeling was priceless. As they began walking again, Shaq gently asked, "Do you have someone to help? You get your groceries and medicine today." She hesitated, embarrassed. "Usually, I manage on my own. It just takes me longer." Shaq nodded thoughtfully. "Well, not today. Today, you've got me." Her eyes widened. "You. But you must be so busy," he chuckled warmly. "I've got time. And besides, I don't think anyone's going to tell me I can't carry groceries." The elderly woman laughed, a sound that hadn't left her lips in weeks. It was small, shaky, but filled with joy. For once, the weight of her daily struggles felt lighter. The thought that someone like Shaquille O'Neal's, someone the world admired, would take time to walk beside her filled her with hope. And so, they continued down the street. Side by side, the giant with the gentle heart and the woman whose dignity had been restored. Passers-by watched in awe, some smiling, some even recording, but what mattered most was how she felt inside. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt forgotten. She no longer felt like a burden. She felt human again. Respected whole, and that was worth more than any amount of money she had gone to the bank to withdraw.